Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. It's time to get back to my 1969 Farmall 856 restoration. Look at all these parts I've got hung up and painted. The first batch to go back onto the powertrain. Oil cooler, thermostat housing, fan blade, oil pump, water pump, tubing. My process for redoing these tractors is to clean parts by group, by sub-assembly, and then put them back on and repeat. So this is batch one. We'll go through and do that again and again to build this tractor back up. Today I'm focusing on this side of the engine and everything that goes on this side of the engine, and then the front of the engine. Before I get going here, I wanted to bring everybody up to speed on what's been done on this tractor so far. I went back and looked at some of the earlier videos and realized I'd forgotten a lot of what got done, and a lot has been done to this powertrain. First of all, I stripped the tractor down to this and then did a double split, one at the rear end of the engine and then one at the rear end of what you would call the bell housing or the torque amplifier housing. And I replaced the torque amplifier with a rebuilt unit. I rebuilt the MCV, the multiple control valve, which controls power steering and brakes and lubrication, and the torque amplifier, new seals, new springs, new pump in that. I put a new live power spline shaft in the clutch end of the transmission. The old one was starting to strip out. Front transmission seals, a new clutch driven disc, pressure plate, and throwout bearing. Had the flywheel turned and ground. Replaced the engine rear main seal, put new detent plates in the shifters in both the speed and the range transmission. Oh, where does that leave me? Rebuilt the PTO, put a new heavy-duty clutch pack in it, resealed it, put new PTO brakes in that unit, put new seals in the draft sensing linkage at the back end of the tractor. They were leaking really bad. They're kind of big O-rings. That was fun to replace. Put new bushings on the three-point top arms that lower the three-point hitch because they were all wallowed out. Resealed the brake pistons on both sides, disc brake pistons. The discs were in fine shape, so I just scuffed them up and cleaned them up. Removed the clutch pedal pin on that side because they always get worn down quite a bit. That was quite a job. I had to reach in all the way from the back of the tractor and get a wrench in there and take that pin out, and Dad built it up with weld and turned it back down on the lathe to the right size. So got that done. What else? Resealed the hitch hydraulic pump, took the hydraulic pump out of the rear of the tractor and replaced the O-rings on the suction tubes because they're known leakers where they come into the filter housing. I cleaned and painted the tractor, and I'm using PPG Delfleet paint for this tractor, which is a real step up from what I've used before. And the last thing I did is I replaced the front pulley on the tractor because the harmonic balancer, the rubber piece in the pulley, was shot on the old one, so I put a new one on there and a new front crankshaft seal. Whew. My process for parts is piece by piece. I look them all over, I clean them up, I look them over again, I take them apart. If they need further disassembly, I fix anything that I see that's the matter with them. Clean them again, paint them, hang them up like this, tape them off, and then they're ready to assemble. Piece one, what to do about the bolts when painting is always an issue, and whenever I can, I keep the bolts with the assembly, and these nuts are just ones that I grabbed out of the hardware bin, and they're not going on, but they hold everything in place. That way I don't have to paint the bolts separately and lose track of what goes to what. And of course, areas that aren't supposed to be painted get masked off. And this is a conversion gasket set for this engine. Conversion just means it's for the lower end of the engine, from the bottom of the head down, all the gaskets. I'm going to need quite a few out of this for this assembly. I just got to find the right ones. Oh, that looks like a winner. Clean this port up with a little lacquer thinner. It's got some tape residue on it. This is an oil pressure check valve, one of two in the oil supply system. It's just a spring-loaded plate in there that dumps oil when it gets above pressure, set point. Piece 1. Through this piece travels oil and coolant. Coolant travels through here and into the lower part of the water jacket in the engine. So it's the incoming coolant, the cool coolant. And this is outgoing oil coming through here and into the main oil gallery after it goes through the oil cooler, which I'll get to assembling in a minute. Next comes the oil pump, which gets mounted right here. You can see the camshaft back here. This drive gear drives the pump, and the oil to supply to be pumped comes from here. There's a fixed pickup tube inside the engine that goes down into the oil pan. It's not a floater, it's just an oil pickup tube. Pretty cool. You can see in here the oil pump drive gear. This is the camshaft running along here, and here's one of the camshaft lobes, and here's a lifter on the lobe right here. There's another lifter. This elbow that goes into the engine down here has got a metal tube in between it and the oil pump casting with a pair of O-rings in it to hold everything leak-proof. Consequently, I have to line everything up here to get the holes to line. So what we have here, starting from the front, this is the tachometer drive here that drives the hour meter and the RPM gauge. It comes back in here. There's a drive gear in here from the camshaft that drives the shaft that goes back here, and the two gears for the oil pump are in here. I took this apart and checked everything out. There's also another pressure relief valve which looks similar to the one I put in at the oil inlet back on the other side, except this one I think has a higher pop pressure than the other one. Oil comes in here into the pump, gets pumped out here and up to the oil cooler. One of the advantages to a horizontally oriented pump like this is it can hold its prime when the engine's shut off, whereas a vertical one has more of a tendency to drain back. To that end, I'm priming it with some engine oil here because it's lost its prime when I cleaned it. It'll hold that oil in the pump body because the pickup is above the bottom of the housing. Before I get too far with the stuff out here, there's some stuff to go in behind it. You kind of got to work in layers. There's a lot of things to put on here, and this will make it easier. We got a T-fitting that goes into the oil gallery here, and an elbow that goes up into the head here. And this line here feeds oil from the oil gallery down at the bottom and up to oil the top end of the engine. At least I think that's what this line does. This is a breather block here. It's got steel wool in it with a breather at the bottom. That's the next step. And then down at the bottom of that line goes the switch that runs up to the dummy light on the dash for low oil pressure, which I think is like 5 psi, and I'd be a little worried if my oil pressure got that low. Next comes the top end breather tube. This has got an O-ring right here to seal it up. Put a little oil up inside where the O-ring seats here in the bottom of the head, and it goes on just like this, up into the hole. Bracket and a bolt for it down here, hold it in place. I removed all this stuff from the side of the engine when I was stripping the tractor down for two reasons. Number one, it's really hard to do the job I would like to do as far as cleaning and painting with this stuff on. You just can't get behind and do the job that I like to do. The second is that this whole mess, and you'll see it's going to get bigger, is prone to leaking. That was one of the things with the 361 and the 806 and this 407. I'll get to that engine family in a little bit. And this is the most well-known leaker. This tube runs from the oil pump up to what's going to go here, which is the oil cooler. And they've come up with ways to keep these from leaking. Obviously, it's a pipe like this carrying high pressure oil with just an O-ring in the end of it that kind of slides into the sleeve. Well, these are quad rings, and they're shaped like little stars in cross section instead of just round O-rings, so they provide more contact area and help prevent leaking. And I'm going to use these. I don't know if you can see the shape in a close-up. It is like a star. I think I drew a picture of one when I was doing the MCV for this tractor. And you go into this slot, one on each end, like so. Make sure it's not twisted. This is that outlet where I poured oil in earlier. And this bolt on the tappet cover needs to come off temporarily because the bracket hooks on here. Previously I replaced the gaskets on the tappet covers because they're known leakers as well. Might as well put the one on the other end too. This big honking thing is the oil cooler, and it goes on right here. And what you have in this is engine coolant, antifreeze, being used to cool the oil each time it makes a pass through the oil pump and through the circuit. You've got coolant coming in here from the water pump, and it goes through this tube, and if you look inside of it here in cross section, the coolant's traveling in all these little tubes like you would have in a boiler, and the oil's circulating around the coolant in the big tube here. So the oil is coming in from the oil pump here through this pipe, and it's exiting through this pipe and headed to the oil filter. Lots of things to line up here. Oops, you go this way. Then there's a bracket up front to hold it up. When they were developing these engines to build more and more horsepower, hot oil was one issue to deal with. The 282s that came out in the 560s in the 50s are the first IH engine I know of that had an oil cooler. In the 282 in my 656 has one, but it's only about that big. It's a little dinky thing. These engines have squirters from the main bearing bosses that squirt up at the underside of the cylinders to help cool the piston in the cylinder and lubricate the cylinder wall. So I imagine that's one reason the oil is gathering a lot of heat and needs to be cooled. Engines non-turbo 407 had one squirter pointing up at the cylinder, and turboed versions, the DT 407s, had two squirters per main bearing boss. Just some engine trivia. Get this bolt back in the tappet cover. The bracket. I can get everything to line up. It's amazing how whether if I keep the light on or the light off, it changes the color of red on the camera. I much prefer the deeper red. It's what it looks like to me. And you can see that when the light's off. This is a funky red soft rubber O-ring, or some kind of plastic, I suppose. What you which goes right in there. There's a groove in there that that fits into. And that tube is a supply to the dual oil filters. Connected by bolts that I can't see. This is the last pipe. It's got another kind of funny O-ring on top. Goes up in the bottom of the filter housing. And then bolts onto the supply to the oil gallery along here. Oil filters, there are two, the same, Napa 1151 or Wix 51151. Same as any old tractor canister filter, there's a gasket that goes up in groove underneath here. And then in the filter base, you see that assembly down in there? That's a bypass. So there's a spring and a plate so that if the filter gets clogged up and oil's pushing into the center here to be cleaned through the filter and the filter's clogged, it'll pop the bypass so that the engine still gets oil. It won't be filtered oil, but I guess unfiltered oil is better than none. Filter number 2, that spring also holds the filter up tight to the filter housing so oil doesn't leak by. On this engine, the intake air manifold is part of the head, so if you look in through this hole, you can see a valve back there and an intake port. There's another intake port, and it just runs all the way along here. And this is the intake pipe that comes off from the air filter that winds up going up here. Onto the front of the engine. This is the inlet coolant pipe that goes into the oil cooler. And this is the water pump. I just remembered that these bolts that hold the water pump on are through holes into the water jacket, and the reason I suspected is because they have copper washers on them. So they're coming back out and getting some thread sealant. And next, here on the other side of the block, we have the thermostat housing and hot coolant outlet from the head. Now that everything's together for the oil and cooling system, I can show you the path. So here's the oil pump. Let's start here. Pickup tubes down here. Oil comes into the pump, gets pumped up into here, and then goes through the oil cooler into the oil filter. There's a split here, so these aren't in series. They're kind of like in parallel, so oil's free to flow to the one with the least resistance always, or both at the same time, probably most of the time. Anyway, it goes through the oil filters, and comes out into this tube down here and then gets shot into the oil gallery here. I believe that this is a full flow oil filtration system because everything that this pump is pumping is coming out through this tube. There's no other path out of the pump through the oil cooler and then just into the filter, so there's no other outlet in here. The only way it can be a partial bypass is if it pops those valves down at the bottom of each filter, and then it can make its way into here. For the cooling system, we have two inlets. We have this port down here that the pump goes directly into, so coolant's going in that way. And then we have an inlet down here, right there, after coolant goes through the oil cooler. So it's circulating down into those, and then it's coming out up here at the thermostat housing. Remember, we have two modes for cooling. We have bypass mode, where the thermostat's closed and coolant is just circulating around the engine and not into the radiator. And then when the thermostat opens, when things get warm, coolant's coming out here, out of this port, and in here from the bottom of the radiator, and using the radiator to help cool the engine. These are the last pieces of this batch to put on. This fan has been balanced. See these rivets? There's two on this blade and one here, none on the others. That's how they balanced it. That's all the pieces from this batch. I think that next I'm going to concentrate on the front frame. You got to stay down here, Ezra. So that would be the frame rails, the front bolster that's got the power steering unit in it, probably the injection pump and the injectors and the injection lines. That'll be batch 2, along with anything else I can fit in the batch. I want to end this video with a little bit of discussion of engine family history, because that kind of stuff always fascinates me, how things evolve through time. This is a small family that this engine belongs to, the D361 and the D407, and I'm going to have to provide a caveat that I'm still learning about this stuff. I don't have a whole lot of experience. This is the first one of this family of engines that I've worked on. But the history, I believe, is this, that the D361 came out in the Farmall 806 in 1963, and that was a new engine. That was the first version of this. And then when the 856 came out, the D361 was bored a little bit and stroked a little bit to make 407 cubic inches and up the horsepower. Now, when the 806 and then later, a little later, the 1206 came out, they shared the same engine, but the 1206 had some upgrades to the engine and a turbocharger added to make it more horsepower than a 1206. The same thing happened with the three upper models of this series. So the three upper models are the 856, the 1256, and the 1456. All three of them have a 407 engine, this engine. But they did things to the engine and the rest of the powertrain in the 12 and the 1456s to raise the horsepower by about 50 horsepower difference stock without turning up the pumps between the 856 and the 1456. So they did things like adding extra oil squirters to spray up on the pistons. They added a turbo to the 1256. They added a larger turbo to the 1456. They put a larger injection pump on the 1456 to push more fuel in. So they did a lot of little upgrades, but it's the same basic engine unit. These engines were known back in the day for their long life. They have a large, total weight to horsepower output ratio. In other words, there's a lot of steel in them. So from what I've read, it wasn't uncommon to get 20,000 hours of life out of the first version of the engine. In other words, before it was ever rebuilt. The problem came in in rebuilding them. It takes practically a machine shop with a lot of specialized tools to do them correctly. One of the reasons they had such long life is because they use dry liners. Instead of most diesel engines use wet sleeves. The sleeves go right down in, but the dry liners have more beefiness to them. They're less likely to warp, and they're less likely to suffer the degradation from cavitation, which is bubbles in the coolant working against the sleeves in an abrasive way. All those things combined made it a long life engine, but it takes a lot of specialized equipment, I guess, to fit new sleeves and to rebuild the engine to tolerances. So usually after the first rebuild, they don't have that 20,000 hour life unless you have a really good rebuilder. Anyway, these are things that I'm researching more and more now. After 1971, when the 1456 series ended, International introduced the 400 series engines, and the most famous version, I guess, which I think is still in production, is the D466, used in buses and all kinds of industrial equipment and tractors for a while. And so those really took over and this engine faded out. Anyway, it's on to round 2. I gotta start cleaning parts all over again. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.